Our topic continues with Genesis, but then we brought in the idea of numbers because without understanding that numbers are figures of speech in the Bible and they have a root in the Genesis account, the creation account, we cannot advance in understanding what all these figures of speech using numbers are for in the Bible. The Genesis creation account was an elaborate Hebraism depicting high rulers over God's creation. And we showed many issues that defy a physical or a literal understanding or interpretation of this account. And now our next task is to show what a firmament means in figures of speech, because the attentive one may by now be asking, well, if these lights in Genesis meant rulers, rational rulers, what does it mean that they are set in a firmament? Because the creation account clearly says that lights were set in the firmament to give light. What sense does that make to set them in the firmament? Because we know the firmament physically means heaven, but what else can it mean when in figures of speech? Because these lights are living beings, as we illustrated, rulers over God's creation. So if they are rational creations of God, what does the firmament have to do with their influence? Since we don't see living creations in the sky, the firmament cannot therefore be ignored. It has to be illustrated in the context of what these lights mean. No detail in figurative speech is redundant. The firmament is a realm or a device, so to speak, which serves to hide creations of God who influence others, others being lesser creations, in that it keeps the high ones invisible to the lesser ones, as God has ordained. As you can see, it is written that let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. The term midst means it is a part of the environment of those waters. That's what the term midst means. It isn't a physical division as we understand barriers in our physical existence. That is the glory of God. For us, we use physical walls. He uses spiritual walls in our very beings. Now, some of us who have had dealings with angels, who have been in contact with angels, can relate to this scenario in that they appear and disappear, and yet you are aware that they are not gone far. They are still around us. That is the firmament helping them to be invisible to us. That is the firmament in the midst of the water. It works by nature or form of a creation. It isolates specific forms or classes of God's creations from each other, according to their classes of form, in that lower forms of creations are under a specific firmament, not physically under it, but that their nature is isolated in doing so. That means in being under that firmament. Those that are separated are kept together by that barrier or firmament, even as a wall keeps those inside it in the way it is designed to do. So those under the firmament cannot see or interact with those who are said to be above that firmament, unless, of course, God enables them to do that. Whereas those said to be above can interact with those below it, because this was put in place to separate natures of God's creations. These terms above and under are for an example which Jesus Christ used when he told off the Pharisees, saying, "You are from below and I am from above." He meant nature, even though the idea of his coming from above, which we know as heaven being above, is also in the picture, but essentially meant the nature, his nature being above the nature of those to whom he was speaking. That is the above and under that firmament. That's why that psalmist praises God, and also in doing so exhorts those waters which are above that firmament to join him in giving God praises, because waters means uncategorized creations of God, as the angel gives away that meaning in Revelation chapter 17. Therefore, in a faulty understanding of those waters in Genesis and this firmament, it would mean that God is in the firmament and has his throne there. If you understand this verse physically, it would mean that God is in that firmament, since his throne is said to be in heaven, which firmament he called the heaven, and that there are waters above that firmament. Therefore, there are waters above his throne. If you physically understand this creation account, since he says that the heavens are his throne, whereas the heavens is there to divide the waters into two, those above him and those below him, meaning the waters. And it would also mean that he removed the earth from the water to put the heavens in the water. Quite absurd if you must stick with a physical understanding of this creation account and following through with its logical conclusion in all details in all verses. This is how a literal understanding blinds us to many wonders of this book, particularly in the Genesis account. So concerning that firmament and those who are set in it today, a good example are the angels we just touched upon, whom we all know that they are in our midst this very moment, taking note of every detail of our lives, and yet even though they are in the same rooms with us, but they are not visible. That is what the firmament is there for in God's creation, to help these who have influence behind the scene to do their duties without interference from those below. Angels are therefore said to be in that firmament or above a specific firmament because they are levels of rulers and lesser creations of God, themselves who are rulers, even though they are lesser in the context of other rulers, having God as the ultimate ruler over all creation. And therefore it is written, the heavens of the heavens are his, meaning he watches all his creations, including those who watch others. Now there are lots of figures of speech in Genesis, but when God says let fowls fly in the firmament, it is an idiom in many prophetic books to mean practices of ruling angels or spirit rulers with influence. Rulers often called fowls of heavens. Their influence also simply indicated as having wings, if not indicated as flying. For an example, the wings of abomination of Daniel, that is the emphasis upon being a fowl of heaven, or simply called a fowl with wings. And in many scriptures, you may have read them. For an example, a flying eagle in Revelation, which detailed in that verse, I'm sure many simply pass by it without recognizing what actually they are for, because we all know that eagles fly, so it's needless to say a flying eagle. It was a figure of speech. But these use that barrier called the firmament to influence the earth, coming and going unseen, whereby most of them do a lot of mischief to humans, doing it behind the scenes, and we do not know that it's these guys behind the scenes who are doing all these things. So those who have this ability to their nature, are they said to fly in the firmament of heaven, to mean activities unique to rulers who have ability to traverse these barriers, because there are many according to echelons of rulers. That's why it's written that there are levels of heaven, because you read that God called the firmament heaven, but then scripture says there are heavens, levels of heavens. That's the point behind this firmament in the midst of the waters. And for the purpose of that firmament being for separating, therefore do higher ones called lights use it for their influence over all the earth. These higher ones also, when uncategorized, they are called light and darkness. And that's why when we follow activities of these higher ones called light and darkness, humans therefore also become children of light and children of darkness. That's the context of this firmament to these rulers called as light and darkness. The figure of firmament to divide the water is because waters is a figurative term to mean uncategorized creations of God. The angel gives away that meaning in Revelation in figures of speech. That Revelation chapter 17 verse 15, whereby in the whole Bible that's the plainest of places where we can understand the meaning of waters as a figures of speech, and therefore it cannot be improved upon. That is the same waters even in Genesis. Remember, all these terms have to be consistent in how they are used, whether in the prophets or in the Gospels, including this Genesis. So they cannot mean something else in Genesis and then mean something else in Revelation. The message is one. It's like a chain. It's linked from Genesis to Revelation. As we said, the firmament is not in the middle, but in the midst. There is a difference. Midst simply means it is a part of the environment, but middle is a division. It means positional, it's in one place, but midst, it's all over the place. That means partaking in the environment where it is said to be in the midst. Even as God said he walks in the midst of the camp of the Israelites. Normally, lower creations are the ones signified as waters in all scriptures, if given in figures of speech. And for what this is worth, rulers over those waters, these are signified as rivers or streams. For an example, we have that in Psalm 24, where God says that the earth is founded upon the seas and the rivers. The seas are the marine kingdom that we all know in layman's terms. The rivers are not very familiar as a figure of speech, but they mean other rulers who are higher than these called the seas. That is why you see that a river goes out of Eden to water the garden in Eden. Or in Ezekiel, where it says the river goes out of the temple to water the desert and the sea in Ezekiel. It all meant those with influence, higher influence over the earth, called those who have this kind of influence, a class called rivers. They are rulers. This therefore shows that we are dealing with the rational creations of God at that point in time in Genesis, creations with vast influence in the earth in that Genesis account. Since you see that that river from Eden splits into 4 heads. Now a head always means a ruler in scriptures. These terms have to be consistent in the way they are used. Genesis, the Gospels, or even the prophets, they are consistent, whether physical or spiritual, whether used in a spiritual sense or when used as a physical record of events. And that's how these also appear in Genesis, but in an elaborate figure of speech, which many miss. So then by this river and its 4 heads, you know God is not giving an account of rivers literally, but rulers who are in Eden for his own purposes to oversee that place called the Garden of Eden. That is the going out of Eden for watering of the garden, as you note, more unnatural language that defies our traditional understanding of this account, saying the river goes out of Eden to water the Garden of Eden. These are the details missed, and there are many. Now, Jesus Christ taught us a very crucial lesson, showing that we ought to pay attention to the grammar and the words in them. That is in his argument with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, there is a lot to explain in this Genesis account, but it wasn't our topic. Rather, that by being aware of some of the mess we made of it in our traditional understanding, we may salvage something from it for understanding other concepts in the Bible that depend on understanding it correctly. So now at this point, we go on to the actual use of numbers as symbols in scriptures, but we start with the easily recognizable cases of them being figures of speech, even by many who may not have a good familiarity with this figure of speech of numbers, before we go on to others that are not easily inferred from the context. Taking a ratio in the laws that depended on numbers corresponding to days of a week and days or days in a sequence to mean specific future realities, because laws are symbols of future rulers essentially, and these are for the most part about rulers. The days in the laws of Moses and the hours and the specific time of the evening or morning, all these specified times of future rulers over God's creation. As we said, we are going to start from the shallower part of the water, so to speak, in particular with the number 7 and that of 8 when used as figures of speech, because the figure of 7 is fairly known as a figure of speech, though this number 8 as a symbol may not be very familiar, so it is news to many. Remember always that days and months and years of observance prefigured unique servants of God, of whom some are categorically signified as a Sabbath. Now, we already saw this in our earlier teaching, but other generations or times of a specific people are simply given as appointed seasons or years or months or days, whereby of those simply given as days, most are given as a sequence of them, say the 2nd day or the 3rd day, whereby on the 3rd day, nothing of the sacrifice of peace offering could be eaten, or in case of months, where we see a month in sequence of them, but a month also considered in terms of certain of its specific days, and so forth. These all meant a people in their unique circumstances, the very things the Apostle Peter taught Bishop Clement and others in this bishop's lifetime, saying that the apostles were Jesus Christ's months and himself as the acceptable year. whereby Peter lifted that figure of speech of days to mean beings of influence from Isaiah, and also the same figure of speech which Jesus Christ used in parable, saying he was the day and his apostles the 12 hours. This is the idea behind the 7th and the 8th day in figures of speech. But tracing the point that these figures refer to rational creations indeed, or their circumstances depending on context, let's again bring up that writing from recognitions of Clement, who is an ancient bishop taught by Peter, one of the church fathers from the apostles' generation, that we may see and understand that this indeed is a figure of speech that means beings of influence. So you can read this unnatural depiction in that Peter calls Jesus Christ as the acceptable year of God, but in Isaiah not plainly given as such, whereby if you read that naturally, you would think he's talking of years and days of vengeance, whereas he's talking of beings of influence, of whom is Messiah. Therefore, you see in that except that Peter calls themselves, the apostles, as Jesus Christ's months, whereby this speech of Peter parallels Jesus' parable in this John, in that Jesus called himself as the day and the apostles as the 12 hours. That was the figure of speech, using numbers to refer to rational beings. But if one isn't aware of this speech, this is all lost on them. This use of numbers to refer to rational beings as Jesus Christ and Peter used it is the whole point of numbers or references to figurative measures of all sorts in the laws of Moses and in the prophets, such as we see in Ezekiel's temple. So this is the very idea behind our first example in illustrating figures of speech using numbers in scriptures. We start with the 7th day and the 8th day, whose ratios in the laws of Moses were consecutive, because they are easy to follow as we read on from Leviticus chapter 14, starting from verse 2, which reads, "This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought unto the priest," skipping on to verse 7, "and he shall sprinkle upon him that is to be cleansed from the leprosy 7 times, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in the open field." Don't miss how the count of 7 in these scriptures is used, because if you don't, then shall the figure of a 7 and that of 8 becomes clear shortly. You notice that in verse 7 they are simply pronounced clean, and that mere pronouncement to be clean is the point here which we must keep note of to start with reading Leviticus chapter 14 verse 8. "And he that is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. And after that he shall come into the camp and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. Again, notice after he was pronounced clean in verse 7, yet he's doing more to be clean in this verse 8. This time involving a count of 7 of staying outside of the tent, not the camp. I wish we could go into details of this, but we can't. But take note of how, again, when 7 appears, cleansing is provisional. He is simply pronounced clean. Whenever there is a 7, there is a mere pronouncement of clean, but there is more of cleansing yet to come. So he stays outside of the tent, that he or she doing these things may be clean. Staying outside of their tent for 7 days is the second point to note here, in that in it the number 7 is used. Just to give away something before we go into details, as long as there are things to do in the counts of 7, cleansing of a man in the laws of Moses was temporal. It was provisional, while counts are still in their 7s, no matter what that count of 7 involved. As it is noticed in verse 7 that when sprinkled, the sinner was pronounced clean. And also after all that washing, some more washing in verse 8, they are doing more cleansing, and yet again they are simply pronounced clean. So in verse 8 you would think, well, they are clean, but that is not so because of what that number 7 is there for in those scriptures. Reading Leviticus chapter 14 verse 9. "But he shall be on the 7th day, that he shall shave off all his hair of his head and his beard and his eyebrows, even all his hair he shall shave off, And he shall wash his clothes, also he shall wash his flesh in water, and he shall be clean. Here you see that because it is the seventh day, still being a number falling within the count of 7, the cleansing is still provisional. And so even on this seventh day, he does more of all cleansing commanded, but again he is simply pronounced clean, because this cleansing is still in the symbolism of the number 7. To stop here for a moment and explain what is going on in those verses of Leviticus chapter 14, the number 7 scriptures refers primarily to 2 uses. The first being that the number 7 refers to issues whose nature or purpose or duration or extent of these issues or any other reason for giving this number 7 as an element is signified by it are ultimate in some form. So the issues signified or attached to this number 7, they are in their ultimate form or state or circumstances, meaning that the number 7 as a symbol refers to issues or events which are complete in some sense in the future or in other circumstances, distant from the time of consideration of those things. So it refers to things future but depicted as being complete at the time of giving that symbolism of the number 7. And so when it is attached to that of a day, as it is here being the 7th day, these are the elements it refers to in figures, such as we see referred to in this cleansing on the 7th day, or with things in the count of 7. And so a 7, in one of its uses as a figure of speech, it refers to things in a final state, but whose details are yet unrevealed, and therefore knowledge belonging to the Most High alone, obviously, and to those to whom he has revealed these things. But essentially, that's what it means. It means future things. Therefore, at the time that the laws of Moses were given, the cleansing that was final but depicted by those rituals was not fully known in all its details when it would be. But at the time it would be, that would be the end of the 7th day. Secondly, when the figure of 7 is a symbol in prophecy, and it is primarily the use you see here in Leviticus chapter 14, when this is a figure, it also signifies realities that last within the dispensation of the laws of God before the precepts of Messiah entered the earth. And from the time the doctrine of Messiah is practiced way into the millennium or the millennial reign, that period is signified by the number 8, or as an 8th day, or of things counted up to the number 8, or its multiples, depending on context. So this second purpose of the number 7 as a symbol refers to things that concern the laws of sacrifice and offerings. So this aspect of referring to things concerning the laws of Moses is primarily which is at work here in verses 7, 8, and 9 in Leviticus chapter 14, because of the nature of righteousness in those laws. Though the first purpose of the symbolism of this number 7 to show or depict ultimate issues is also in the picture in this Leviticus chapter 14, if you magnify all the elements of this passage and elsewhere in Leviticus. Therefore, the count of things in their sevens, or things in the count of multiples of 7, these counts are linked to the nature of laws in the earth coming before the doctrine of Messiah. And so this cleansing is provisional, just as apostles taught that the righteousness of the laws of Moses and backwards wasn't really a righteousness that purges the conscience. That's why you see numerous washings and sprinklings and pronouncement of being clean in these verses, and yet they are not clean. And so such things, scriptures categorize them into a period signified by the count of 7. And so back to the cleansing of the leper come the 8th day after staying outside of the tent for 7, but in the camp, and is finally cleansed at the end of the rituals done in the 8th day. So reading Leviticus chapter 14 verse 10. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 he lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb of the first year without blemish, and 3/10 deals of fine flour for a meat offering mingled with oil, and 1 log of oil. For a brief summary, we observe that the 8th day events of cleansing a leper were sequential to those done on the 7th day, because the eighth day rituals concerned righteousness and a new nature from that righteousness. And this is what we meant by the complementary nature of the symbolism of the number 7 and that of 8, in that their uses in scripture are kind of hierarchical. That means their uses are complementary in certain aspects to refer to specific periods at the time of the laws, which things were not past, but for the most part, future realities. One instance being the laws of Moses, in that at the time the laws were given, the things they depicted were future, not past realities. Even though the meaning of that number 7 has also aspects that refer to the past. The cleansing in the 7 days wasn't permanent because the ways of Moses are reckoned in the 7 days and those of Messiah are reckoned as an 8th day. And with those in the 8th day comes the final cleansing before God. Therefore, the cleansing done in the 8th day is the final to reflect the ways of the elect. The elect signified as an 8th day, or whose generation is signified as an 8th day. And so from the rituals of the 8th day was a person considered fully clean, because the 8th day is the age of Messiah, the age of the elect, the saints of the living God, who are called the elect of God. Again, remember, a day of ritual or appointment in the laws of Moses signifies a specific age, which age signifies a people. So in the Hebrew language, when that age is given a number, that number signifies a people or the age in which they manifest. But essentially it is used to refer to a people. Now the number can be given in the form of a date, can be given in the form of a month or a year, and so forth. Therefore, the figure of the number 7 and that of the number 8 are in a hierarchy of sorts, because one cannot be unless there is another. The number 8 refers to realities in the new age. However, because the new age comes essentially by the agents of Messiah and by his doctrine, and the doctrine of Messiah is essentially ushered in or made known by the laws of Moses. Therefore, the symbolism or the meaning of the number 8 starts from the point in time when Messiah's ways and Moses' ways are both in the earth, before the powers of the new age are fully manifest. Because it's obvious and it's written that Messiah was born under the laws of Moses. And so even though Messiah and his ways are the 8th day, and Moses' ways are signified by the 7th day or 7 days, but Messiah's ways come when Moses'